Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files. Hello, Louie.
Hello, Matthew. Good morning.
How are you today?
I've had a couple of gardening disasters. I've just chopped through an electrical cable twice in a row.
Oh, well done. That's good.
Yeah,
twice.
That was good.
So you obviously managed to repair it or something, or you just had it? Were you just getting angry with it?
Well, I cut through an electrical extension cable, cutting the hedge. Went to Tesco's, came back, and then my partner cut through the hedge trimmer cable. So there we go.
So a good morning then.
Wonderful. But I think it would be cheaper to have paid somebody to do the job. Welcome to Gardener's question. Question time.
Gardener's existential question time, as in just so that the hedge remains uncut. You're still left with an uncut hedge. So most of the hedge is
cut, and thank God for shears is all I can say.
Well, there you go. That's what we're coming back down to. So it sounds like you might be worrying about that a little bit, because that's like a really kind of awful, terrible segue into how I guessed maybe today.
I was certainly worried when I handed the device over to my partner, and then I could see she was going to do it, and she did it. So well done there. Yes, today we are joined by another special guest, as always, because we seem to have turned into a guest show, haven't we? Today we are joined by, I believe he's an English professor, Francis O'Gorman. Is that right, Francis? And you're currently a professor at Edinburgh University. Is that right, Francis?
That's correct, yes. In the English department.
Do you want to give us a little, because we usually have psychologists on this show, and so it's nice to have somebody a bit different, because sometimes, we're psychologists, and sometimes I think, we end up being a psychology podcast, but we're not a psychology podcast. We're more of a kind of what it is to be a human in the universe podcast, and obviously not everyone is a psychologist. Do you want to give us a little introduction about yourself, Francis?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to chat with you. I am a literary critic, and I've worked mostly on the English literature of the 19th century, particularly Victorian poetry and fiction and non-fictional prose. And throughout all my time as a literary critic, I have, of course, been interested in works of writing as expressions of consciousness, as forms of consciousness. And so there is a natural overlap with the various different kinds of psychology and psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and so forth, which interest me alongside this. And in 2015, I published a book called Worrying, Literary and Cultural History, which came out from the New York offices of Bloomsbury. And it's not an academic book. It was an attempt to find an honest, as well as I hope, funny way of writing about low-level anxieties, day-to-day, common or garden groans, really, which wouldn't interest any kind of serious psychoanalyst, or certainly wouldn't interest a GP. But the forms of kind of low-level anxieties, did I leave the toaster on, did I leave the back door open, which occupy quite a lot of many people's daily lives.
And because if I can just butt in, I mean, I remember you calling it a kind of literary "there's no help" book, which I kind of had me chuckling away as almost an antidote for all these kind of self-help books. Yeah. That's the kind of book I'm looking for. I must admit. And Matthew and I, before you joined us, Francis, we were chatting that we're both worriers of that kind of low level. I mean, we haven't been locked up yet, so we're hoping it's just the low level stuff that we are worriers of. And I certainly was intrigued by that the no help, there's no help book, because it is kind of I mean, certainly from our experience, it is a general fundamental experience that we worry. As you say, did we leave the back door open? Am I going to cut through an electrical cable?
I quite like the fact that Francis said common or garden worries. Absolutely. So we'll be talking about your garden worries this morning, which is very appropriate. But I want to ask them, Francis, what led you to write a book on that? Why was it something? Would you describe yourself as a worrier? Is that something that kind of drew you to this as a topic to write a book on?
Yes, certainly. I'm most certainly a worrier, and although I suppose that I wanted to keep an academic distance from the topic, and I didn't want it to be self-indulgent. Perhaps some readers think it is self-indulgent, but I did, I suppose, want to explore both what it felt like to worry, and I suppose what kind of cultural and intellectual and indeed even theological implications there were within our sort of, this low-level fretfulness that we experience so regularly.
And so go on.
Well, I was going to ask you, Franz. I mean, one of the questions that came to my mind, I mean, I did a little search of your book, and I did not find the word existential in it at all. And I wondered if, seeing as you're an English professor, and certainly existentialism is somewhat seen as a European philosophy, is this a kind of a conscious attempt to distance? Is there something, is worrying Englishness and existentialism, is that something that the French get up to, but we don't take it that far as English people? I mean, can I ask you briefly, O'Gorman? Now that's not an English name, is it?
No, my families are principally Irish and English, and I discovered relatively recently that I'm also 1/16 Hungarian, which I find quite interesting. But no.
So is that the bit that worries then? This is the Kafkaesque kind of...
That's right. Yes, I did actually wonder about that, whether there was a kind of Kafkaesque strain of being caught up in the castle somehow. I mean, right. I think what the question that you're asking, the twofold question, one is, where is existentialism in the book? And the other question is there other kind of national borders to worrying, if you see what I mean? I didn't tackle, or I didn't address myself to the European tradition of existentialism in the book. You're right. Although I suppose at one level, my argument is that worrying is really an existential condition, that in order to be a species that did not have the capacity to worry, we would really have to go back to the beginning of the development of the species and go in a different direction. My argument really was that worrying is the kind of dark sister of choice, as it were. As soon as that we have the possibility of choosing our way ahead, we have the capacity to speculate, and that's the breeding ground for these low-level anxieties. So it is part of who we are. The question, however, is complicated, isn't it? By this idea of national borders. Is there something peculiarly British, peculiarly Northern, peculiarly English about worrying? I didn't think about that topic adequately in the book, and I have been subsequently thinking about it. And I've wondered to what extent worrying in British culture is, because it's a sort of underground activity, might perhaps be particularly vivid to us, because for long traditions of kind of British manners, there's been a reticence, hasn't there, about talking about the inner life. We have got very powerful notions, I think, loosening now, but we have had in the past very strong notions of self-control, and of the kind of vanity, really, of talking about ourselves. And I wonder if that's not been a factor in making the experience of worry, because it's been driven so much underground, peculiarly strong, peculiarly kind of vivid to us.
I mean, I'm reminded of, I was sitting in a restaurant last night and they came for a dessert, and I really wanted 3 scoops of chocolate ice cream, but I felt this intense worry that perhaps if I was asking for 3 scoops, am I asking for too much? Am I then overstepping the boundary? And someone's going to be saying, well, he's left us with, all the chocolate ice cream gone, and the people I was dining with, they could not understand what I was going on about. They were like, well, you're paying for it, you should be able to buy whatever you want. But I thought, I do think that manners is part of what I think causes. I mean, it's like queuing, isn't it? There's a reason why the English are very good at queuing. I think part of it is because we just don't want to start having arguments with people. I mean, I don't know what you think there, Matthew. Are you a good queuer?
Oh, well, I say, if you're talking about kind of Britishness, that's one thing we are known for. But I mean, I'm wondering again in terms of, so that you would see that. So, Francis, would you see that as one of these kind of common or garden worries, as in one of those little kind of worries about stuff which broadly is inconsequential, but they're things that we are kind of drawn to, and we just find ourselves, perhaps, as you mentioned, the nature of being human is we have this tendency to worry. It's a normal thing, and they're not necessarily the kind of existential worries. So I'm wondering why, we often kind of sit and ponder on those big questions, which most of our days we don't spend time doing. We get on with just doing stuff, chopping through cables and so on. And so are we kind of more focused on just those little kinds of, as you say, low-level common or garden worries? To what extent are those bigger ones also part of it? Is it that they're the backdrop to it? Is it the fact that there's this nice line saying, well, at some point it's death, when actually all this goes away, it falls away into oblivion, because that's where we actually stop worrying. And is that, for us worriers, us that do find ourselves worrying, is that the only point at which we can actually let go of some of these things? Because I think it has an assumption that I'm someone who does worry, but I'd like to not worry.
Yes. Yeah.
So how is there a way, maybe it's the psychology question side, is it appropriate to try to let go of the worries, or is it accepting, saying, no, that's just the nature of being human. When you wake up in the morning, part of your time will be spent worrying, because that's the nature of being human. We all do it. And it's actually probably not even appropriate to call ourselves worriers, because that's just being human.
Yes. Yes. Well, there's a huge amount in what you say, and a variety of different responses one could make. Here are some. Worrying is a practice of mind, it seems to me, in which we express a desire to control the future, however modestly, in a world where we know that we can't. So worrying is a sort of practice of attention, it seems to me, to the future. It's a kind, in a way, I say in the book, it's where prophecy went. It's where sort of Apollo went after Delphi was closed down. It's a way of trying to take control over a future which we can't. So I think within the minimal, the minor worries of every day, there are some very big psychological implications. And two things particularly strike me here. One is that we can, if we are refocusing our mind upon the minor things over which we would like to take control, whether I shut the back door or not, we're doing some sort of valuable psychic work, it seems to be, in displacing larger anxieties which might be thought existential, which might be thought about, our bigger and much more challenging relationship with a future which we can't control, and eventually we will find ourselves without a future. So I think there's some sort of, I suppose Anna Freud might think of them as a sort of, the ego defense against the id. I don't think one needs to invoke that language, but it's quite useful of thinking of the practice of worrying as doing some psychic work for us in distracting us. Sorry, carry on.
No, I was going to ask then. So again, it's this reflection on whether worrying is good, because I think it has this idea that to worry is not a good thing. The word itself has that sense of, well, don't worry about it. If you're worrying, it's causing yourself mental anguish, which you can do without. To me, that's what's kind of implicit in the term. Yes. And maybe, are there other terms that actually don't necessarily have that sense of, oh, it's something you should try to do less of or minimize. It's just part of its thinking. It's pondering. It's allowing ourselves to explore ideas. Worry has some sense of something negative about it, and therefore it has this idea that is there ways in which we can perhaps minimize it or reduce it.
Yes, I mean, this last part of the book takes the idea that worrying is quite useful. If only we could take away the pain of it. Though perhaps there are evolutionary and psychic value in the fact that there is pain, because that's the only way, it might be said, that we are going seriously to be encouraged to plan better. See, it seems to me that the good thing about worrying and the good thing about being a worrier is that one tends to be caught out less. I worry hugely about transport. So I'm on train stations half an hour before the train is due in. I'm sitting around in airport lounges far longer than I need to be. But now, at one level, that's a nuisance, and it's the product of a certain low-level kind of psychic pain. But the good thing is that I tend to be on the train on time and get to where my destination and so forth. So, I mean, I think the as a practice of attention to the future, worrying, despite the discomfort of it, is very useful. And I also think, and perhaps this is me trying to make myself feel better about myself, but I also think that worriers tend to be quite reflective and contemplative people. It's a sort of, I mean, you can make a kind of claim that it's almost an intellectual activity. You're thinking through the implications of X. You're trying to work out what would happen if X went in this particular direction instead of that. And so I like to think that there are a kind of advantages, sort of intellectual advantages. I think worriers make, potentially quite good lawyers, fretting about that single word in the contract through which, millions of pounds could suddenly fall if you get the word wrong. I think there's a kind of intellectual attentiveness in the best side of worrying, which is a valuable human skill.
Exactly. So we're just intellectually attentive. That's all we are. That I'm okay with that.
So
there's no pain involved in that.
I had two questions that popped into my mind. I mean, the first one was about then, as somebody, and I consider myself quite, an existentialist, and I very much like the European, Camus and Kafka and say Dostoevsky, for example. So as an English professor, say, are there equivalents that I should be reading? Is my first question to you, Francis. But secondly, it popped into my mind. So as a literary critic, you've just written this book. I mean, was it a worry that your work was now going to be criticized, assessed? I mean, was that something that worried you, Francis?
Well, for me, writing it is very much a form of worry. As a literary, I mean, I can make a case that my kind of activity as a literary critic looks a little bit like worrying. That is to say, I worry away at a line of a verse. I think about its implications. I mean, one of the things that worriers do, it seems to me, is that they're looking for hidden meanings, as it were. They're thinking, well, if X happened, maybe there would be some other implication that I haven't thought about. Worrying, in a sense, is a way of dealing with the ambiguity of experience, it seems to me. The fact that it could spin off in a different direction from the one that you thought it was going to. And actually, that's not such a bad model of being a literary critic, thinking about the implications of literary words, literary lines that are not the plain sense, not simply what you think they are. The first part of your question about the literary warriors in English, well, this will seem a strange statement to make from a person who's worked primarily in 19th century English literature, but I mean, I think the great achievement of the 19th century novelists in English it is overshadowed by the achievement of Dostoevsky, and particularly Crime and Punishment. But in terms of where we might find acute writing about worry, well, I mean, I find Charlotte Bronte particularly interesting as a writer about the inner life. I don't think one could quite call it, she writes about worry, but she does begin to open up in English fiction a new language for writing about what De Quincey would call the involutions of reverie, the kind of the knottiness and fretfulness of the inner life. I think that I've always thought that T.S. Eliot was particularly interested in worry. You've only got to read some of his letters to realise that he was himself a worrier. And I think that some of his writing, particularly for quartets and the plays, are interested in the kind of cyclical nature of worries, the way that things keep coming back and being fretted at. And I think looking at Virginia Woolf, one also sees the most extraordinarily luminous writing about, particularly in Mrs. Dalloway, I think, of human beings fretting about their futures, fretting about the decisions that they made in the past. Cast into the most humane and luminous of literary art.
So there you go, Louie. You've got a nice long list there to pick through.
And I'm thinking, I mean, I feel slightly like I'm going to slightly make a fool of myself as we're going slightly off piste in the old, since you know, literary criticism is not our area or my area. But I mean, I somewhat think that, I mean, and I think it's fairly well recognized that, you know, Hamlet is perhaps, you know, I mean, he is a warrior. I mean, and he is a great existential, you know, character. Was there something about, you know, did you know, if Hamlet is a great existential character, was there something that happened that stopped, you know, those kind of thoughts being written about in English or anywhere, Francis? I mean, I don't know if my question made any sense. I'm blathering. I mean, there's a slight blather. If I'm a warrior, I'm also a blatherer.
Well, this is a tough question to answer, I think. The question is, I suppose, a version of that bigger question: can we write the history of an emotion? Does a mental condition, if that's what worrying is, have a biography? It's as I say in the book, it's hard not to imagine that, you know, prehistoric man hiding behind a rock was not in some way or another worrying about whatever it was, some saber-toothed tiger or whatever it is. But we lack the documentation, don't we, across so much of modern history, really to know, I think for sure, whether our common or garden worries really were part of the mental experience of, say, the Renaissance. Did they have different ways of thinking about the future? Did our kind of low-level fretfulness make sense to them? It's a very hard question to answer. I think what's an easier question to answer is to track the emergence of the word worrying into British culture, into the English language, and not only the emergence of the word, but the kind of business of conceptualizing it. That's easier to do. And I think what one sees is that the idea of a kind of low-level fretfulness about the future, labelled as worrying, really has come into literary and popular culture and into kind of general writing about the psychology of the human mind by the end of the 19th century. And in the years between the wars, you get the flourishing, if that's quite the word, of the first worry self-help books. And the ones that I've read tend to be rather finger-wagging, that worrying is self-indulgent, and really the answer to them is really pull yourself together. But some of the ways in which worrying is conceptualized by those self-help books interests me very much, in that they describe worrying as a distinctive psychological product of capitalist modernity. That is to say, their argument in short is that the modern busy world of North America and Europe, as they see it, is so full of opportunities to worry. It's full of activity. It's full of speculations, financial speculations about the future. It's full of commuting. It's full of timetables, and it's full of people. And so those early writers about this state of mind, what one of them calls the disease of the modern world, they interest me because they think of, you know, the biography of worry as as involving a study of the particular psychological implications of capitalism.
Right, and we frequently actually say on this podcast, I mean, we have guests on who equate, you know, the say that the influence, the reduction of the influence of religion, for example, and you know that the surety and the answers that brings with it, and as that's removed, as the secularization of society is comes with it a kind of, I guess you're saying a fretfulness and uncertainty, which in some ways can be a bigger existentialism, but in some ways can be a lower level. Well, if God's not in control, then, you know, maybe I did leave my cooker on or whatever. I mean, is that kind of what you're saying in a way?
Well, I think it's partly that, isn't it? I mean, I think technological modernity of the kind that we see coming into being in the middle of the 19th century does literally provide us with a particularly, an enormous range of opportunities to fret about the future. But the point that you're making about a secular modernity, I think must be relevant. I mean, I think it's easy to caricature Christian believers as being, as it were, incapable of worry because God is in charge. I mean, it obviously doesn't work as simply as that. But I think once you have, for most people, taken away the notion of a God, and therefore of a plan, of you know, what the Greeks would have called the telos, the object, the direction of travel, which is governed by an exterior power. I think once you've lost that, you certainly have multiplied again opportunities to fret, because one's facing the contingency of things. One's facing a world which, you know, or you believe at any rate, does not have a plan.
But I want to ask then, or raise the possibility, or whatever wording I'm looking for, is to say, well, is it just kind of when one's overly fretful or overly worrying? Because you said before that, I like this phrase, intellectually attentive, and you used also an example before where you could sort of think for thousands of years ago that still, early man, there's a point at which you're going to still be trying to consider the environment around you and make plans or think in some way. Is it just when it becomes overly the case, you're overdoing it, overthinking as it were, that it becomes something where there is some discomfort associated with it? Because I think there is something about it's naturally part of thinking, contemplating, considering, and because we are faced with this experience of passing through time, we are going to spend some of that time thinking about what's already gone before and what's coming down the line. But it's when we kind of do that to the point where it's overly so, we're too born with what might happen. The classic thing, cheer up, it may never happen, is this idea of, you're worrying about something which actually, in time, it will come to pass. And when it happens, we deal with things. And often, many times, in terms of this low-level worries about what may be coming down the line, is that when it happens, we're able to deal with it. So it's having attention to it coming down the line, to use this phrase, but not overly concerned with worrying about it to the point where you're not planning for it, you're not preparing for it, you're just overthinking it. Is that the point really where it maybe becomes something we might more appropriately label worry?
Yes, there's very helpful distinctions there. I mean, it's a question that, what one thinks about. I think about it a lot. At what point does worrying become worrying? At what point should we worry about being a worrier? What point does it tip over into something that is disabling and actually a significant inhibitor of daily life? I don't know the answer to that question, but one thing that I find extremely helpful in relation to this, in relation to thinking about how much should I worry about being a worrier, and that's an insight from Adam Phillips in his essay on worrying, and Phillips's brilliant suggestion is that one asks oneself not what one is worrying about, but who the worry is for. That is to say, does it help think of worrying as a kind of, this is putting it in negative terms, a kind of attention seeking, or putting it in more positive terms, it's a way of asking for emotional attention from somebody. And I think that sometimes it is worth taking a sort of step back from one's own worries and reflecting as to whether they have a particular audience in mind, strange though it might sound to say that, and to reflect whether one is trying through a worry, not simply to control an element of the future, the obvious content of the worry, but to change the kind of emotional environment around oneself, to somehow to leave an alteration in a relationship with another person. And one is doing that by, as it were, presenting that person with one's worry.
And like I said, and that's maybe the extent to which you express them and discuss them, because to me that would be a helpful thing, rather than, often to me the idea of worrying is these are actually thoughts going around in one's own head that you're not expressing, that you're not sharing.
Yes.
And therefore they become worries. They become, I've been overly thinking about this for some time, rather than actually sharing it or discussing it. Often reveals it to not be a concern, or that having discussed it, you can consider things from different angles and so on. It's so, to me, almost that becomes a helpful part of the process to help manage any worries or stop them becoming something where we might concern ourselves as being a worry. So that would be my take on it anyway.
And I'm thinking, I must admit, I think most of my worries are things like, am I going to let the cat out of the front door and never see her again? Or am I going to crash the car? Am I going to have to deal with the police? Am I going to have to talk to people? Am I going to get people complaining at me? I often think my worries are intensely narcissistic. I'm really worried about being hassled a lot, and if I can somewhat control some of these things, then I'm going to be in the the easier position of not having a lot of people finger wagging at me, which is how I want to be, rather than communicating perhaps, or attention seeking, I think was how you described it. Whereas I'm almost not wanting any attention. Leave me alone, thank you very much. But I guess we're expressing that all worry is somewhat personal, isn't it? And we each have a slightly different experience.
Yes, I think what you say is it makes a huge amount of sense, and my perspective on this is that I think that a lot of worrying, a lot of the content of worrying, can be brought back to a set of variations, to use a musical musical form, on the theme of personal security. And that's a very complex theme. And I think for me, listening to what you're saying about, I don't want to be hassled. If I crash the car, my partner will be onto me because, it's her car or whatever, or, I too worry about letting my cats out through the front door and never seeing them again. I think that part of that is a fear of being rebuked, whether by the police or by the people with whom one lives. And I think at the root of that might well be a kind of personal sense of insecurity, that there is a fear that the relationship that one has around one with other people can easily turn into one of their chastisement. And it seems to me, and this is how I process this in my own life, at any rate, that's a kind of subset of worry's more general relationship with forms of security, with being able to be oneself without anxiety about who oneself is.
We're back to that self again, Louie.
Well, I was going to say, and I think you're right, Francis. I mean, if I was a 50-foot giant and I could squash my enemies, I think I probably wouldn't care. So I think you're probably right that there is a certain insecurity to, being one man against the world and somewhat being, trapped in that kind of Kafka-esque, cog. You are the tiny little thing and the world is around you. But I think we should draw this episode to a close. I'm worried that the time is pressing on us, and therefore I'm going to say thank you to Francis for joining us for this episode.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis.
And your book was Worrying, a Literary and Cultural History, and I'm sure we can find that in any good bookshop. Is that right, Francis?
Yes, or through the Bloomsbury website.
Brilliant. So thank you for joining us, and
bye-bye for now.
Goodbye.
Yes, thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, Francis. Appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Yes, appreciate that. Lots for us to, I want to say, be intellectually attentive towards.